This essay will discuss the following materials in depth, so there will be spoilers. 2018 film Hereditary, 2018 YouTube video by Just Semantics titled Why Hereditary is Way Darker Than You Think, 2018 film Annihilation, 2018 YouTube video by Folding Ideas titled Annihilation and Decoding Metaphor, 2008 film Lake Mungo, and 2018 YouTube video by Just Semantics titled Lake Mungo and Cinemasochism. Hereditary is a psychological horror film from 2018 about which there has been, at least as I've seen it, considerable debate. Mostly over whether the movie is good or whether it's an over theatrical nightmare. Me personally, I definitely stray toward good. I think it's produced competently, has an extremely strong story to tell, and aside from that, it had personal significance to me for a long while. But this video isn't exactly about analyzing that film, it's about the process of analyzing. To put it shortly, I love watching other people's analyses of media that I enjoy, so that's how I ended up stumbling across a video titled Why Hereditary is Way Darker Than You Think, which, over its runtime, really makes love to the video essay format and tells a story of the movie that I find extremely dubious. The movie's plot begins with Annie Graham, her husband Steve, and her two children Peter and Charlie, all reacting to the death of Annie's mother, Ellen, in their own ways. Over the course of the day of the funeral, the dynamics between all four family members are developed for the audience in detail. Peter seems most put off by Charlie, a little bit more so than his baseline distant teenager attitude toward everyone. Charlie is relatively detached and neurodivergent coded, clearly having a richer internal world than external. Annie feels the most solid affection for Steve, the most fierce protectiveness for Charlie, and a kind of frustrated concern toward Peter. But she's generally a very worn person, so her feelings toward all of them can fray quite a bit when the family is under stress. Steve is quite an internalized person, so we don't really get much from him, but he seems to be closer to Peter than Charlie and have roughly mutual feelings for Annie, though with a little bit more apparent concern for her for reasons that come to light throughout the movie. Ellen's ghost seems to metaphorically haunt the household. Something about her not being here anymore, it throws everyone off their balance. A little while later, Peter gets invited to a party at a classmate's house, which he doesn't tell Annie the full details of, and after her patience is truly worn thin by some more reminders of Ellen's presence, with Charlie found wandering outside in something like a trance, apparently searching for Ellen, it's agreed via a series of aggravated commands that Charlie is coming to the party with Peter, one where she most certainly does not belong or want to go. To make an extremely long story short, Charlie ends up dead by the time Peter is back home. Not just dead, but decapitated, her body sitting in the back seat of the car and her head miles away from the house on a highway. Peter, by that time inebriated, couldn't break himself out of the shock to do anything. Annie was left to discover Charlie laying in the car herself. Up until this point, screen time had been shared unevenly but somewhat fairly between family members, but now we switch to primarily exploring Annie's perspective. It could be said that once Charlie is gone, the family member with the biggest wound left behind by her death is shown for those missing minutes. We see her slowly descend into an aggrieved madness, just as it seems that she might be moving past the event a little bit. A character who just screams at a second watch viewer that she's a cipher for Annie's delusional hope, Joan, bursts onto the scene, first forming a bond with Annie, keeping her grieving and stuck in the black tar of this trauma, and then introducing the paranormal. Joan shocks Annie by performing a seance live in front of her, and now all bets are off. Annie is going downhill unstoppably. Where a healthier path might see her reminiscing, yes, weeping, yes, angry and suffering and all of this, now her memories of her child are tainted by this perverse hope, this delusion that Charlie will come back. She appears to channel Charlie's spirit during a seance of her own, so desperate to be together again. She comes to believe that in her efforts she's made a pact with some sort of evil demonic presence connected to her through Charlie's sketchbook, one of the most sentimental and important remnants of the family's connection to her. And when Steve refuses to destroy it, to destroy this relic of what they used to have, he ends up in flames, where Annie thought she would be, which we seem tempted to believe was really Annie's doing. She was the one with the paint thinner, after all. She was the one who we heard quite clearly earlier had attempted to commit suicide and take her kids with her the exact same way. And there, driven mad by her grief, she appears to be taken over by Charlie's spirit one last time, hanging herself in the attic, presented to us as cutting her own head off with piano wire, mirroring the death of her daughter, while Peter, the one she still blames for Charlie's death, watches in horror. And this proves nothing. It proves nothing about the realist material plot of the movie. See, just semantics would have you believe that all of this, as well as considerably more about the plot and presentation of the movie, is proof that Annie is an unreliable narrator. This requires us to believe, among other things, that Annie is the narrator. However, I failed to mention a scene where a guilt racked Peter has something resembling an allergic reaction while smoking with some of the same friends who invited him to that party, not only mirroring the allergic reaction that Charlie had that ultimately led to her death, but also the fact that being high was what inebriated him enough so that her decapitation on the drive would be more likely. I also failed to mention a scene of Peter in a classroom getting a vivid flashback to the night of Charlie's death, with a personal quality to it that is extremely unlikely to simply be in Annie's fantasy about the inner lives of her family. See, Just Semantics essay presents to us this viewpoint. The supernatural component of Hereditary interacts so intimately with Annie's emotional state and her sanity that fluctuations in her sanity must be what's really going on here, what's really creating the story. And I might also like to add that other characters' states contribute to these changes as well, but since Just Semantics views Annie unambiguously as the narrator, the video doesn't really get into them except to occasionally pick apart what parts of their character are real and what parts are in Annie's head. In fact, Just Semantics' sort of erotic hatred for Annie extends to the movie itself, seeing as the movie is constructed in this theory as a look inside her head, and posits that Hereditary is either a uniquely and remarkably straight faced satire on the way we consume horror, or an irresponsibly made wankfest about gore and shock. Just Semantics tells us and writer director Ari Aster that we cannot have it both ways. And yes, that would be true if movies were explicitly in a realist irrealist binary, but they are most certainly not. What Just Semantics mostly expresses in this video is that they either do not understand what a metaphor is, or didn't pick up that one might be used in the plot of Hereditary, 2018. Let's move on to another work that will help illustrate my point. Annihilation is another 2018 film, also arguably a psychological horror, though this classification can be debated. And in short detail, it uses a sci fi setting as a storytelling device for what the movie is really about, which is perspective, grief, and moving on. However, in Folding Ideas' video about the ways various people were interpreting the film, he rightly points out that the sci fi setting was what seemed to be the entire focus for a great number of people online, talking emphatically about the ramifications of the nefarious game that the monster who killed Cain was surely getting up to, missing the point that the monster is heavily metaphorical. The standpoint that Dan Olson is discussing in this video can rightly be called literalism. And I've said this before and I will continue to say it. When I first heard the word literalist, I thought it meant a person who couldn't read very well, and I went on to learn that that is exactly what it means. A literalist in this context will interpret the story of a film as exclusively being stored in the text, and read either minimally or not at all into the subtext. A literalist might come out of watching Hereditary thinking, wow, that'd be fucked up or what? And not ruminating on the actual subtextual ramifications of the story, the way that the textual story of generational trauma and grief is intimately related to its own subtextual components in the horror. But that's where we get to what I have decided to call anti literalism. An anti literalist would come out of the story saying, wow, that was fucked up how Annie killed her entire family. An anti literalist focuses far too much on the subtext of a work, so much so that it may eschew their interpretations of the text. The fact that the supernatural elements of Hereditary are so entwined with the cerebral ones, and the fact that insanity is quite often brought in, caused an anti literalist to believe that the supernatural elements, in canon, literally did not occur. And while reading too much into something might sometimes be better than failing to read into it at all, it's a little bit too far when a viewer becomes a veritable anti literalist, being so convinced of their interpretation that they firmly believe it is the truth and are willing to ascribe to it either artistic motivation or oversight and negligence on the part of the creator. Anti-literalism is really just one subclass of this same manner of thought that makes every annoying film majors rank Citizen Kane as their favorite movie, whether or not they would actually rate it that way if they didn't know that every other annoying film major ranks it that way. Or middle and high schoolers with mommy issues say that Nietzsche is their favorite philosopher, even if their only motivation for this is having heard the quote, God is dead, and being vaguely aware that the Nazis liked him. It's defiance versus obedience, basically, whether you choose to interpret something typically or whether you choose to really think about it. Just Semantics, of course, didn't just upload one video to their channel ever. One video on the channel from earlier than the one on Hereditary was about Lake Mungo, a horror focused mockumentary which is itself very psychological and is themed around perspective. And the analysis presented in this video is very good, very grounded. It seems to get the film to a much higher degree than demonstrated with Hereditary. And it's funny because one could even call Hereditary and Lake Mungo companion pieces in a way, where Hereditary uses the supernatural to explore grief, whereas Lake Mungo uses grief to explore and explain our belief in the supernatural. But that is ultimately what makes these films different, the fact that they use their themes differently. Lake Mungo's themes, though they aren't written out and spoon fed to the audience direct from the screen, are somewhat more encouraged by the text. The events of the film encourage inquiry in the same way as real world events would, whereas in Hereditary, analysis almost feels like less of a dialogue with the film and more like something observed from the outside, or at least that's how it seems to be with Just Semantics. Lake Mungo gives us questions to ask, whereas it seems that Just Semantics views Hereditary as unwilling to ask any questions of itself, no matter whether or not other people have indeed found many that the text is leading us toward. I would like to briefly construct a bit of a theory to aid in this discussion. We have Lake Mungo and Hereditary, where Hereditary is more inextricable from its metaphor than Lake Mungo is, or rather, Hereditary's text and subtext are more tangled together, I suppose. And if we include Annihilation in this consideration, it's even further toward the tangled side, though the sci fi background isn't the real focus of the film, or for that matter, the book trilogy it's based on. It is focused on quite a bit in order to set up our world, the one that the story plays with to get its message across, and the setting is focused on enough so and intertwined enough with the story that we know that it's not a phantom. Canonically, it does happen in this movie. Perhaps this continuum is poorly constructed, I don't know, but I felt like coming up with some way to explain the strange consequences of how people analyze these films because I thought that Just Semantics' analysis of Lake Mungo was truly beautiful. Maybe it's just the popular movie bias, I don't know.